Welcome to Enigma of the Unknown, where we dive into the most spine-chilling and mysterious tales from across the globe. Tonight, we're venturing deep into the forests, lakes, and swamps of Ohio, uncovering 10 terrifying camping stories that will send shivers down your spine. From the haunting cries of Hocking Hills to the ominous lights of Indian Lake, these tales reveal the darker side of the Buckeye State's wilderness. Dim the lights, settle in, and prepare for a journey into Ohio's haunted legends. Story number 1. The Shadow in Cuyahoga Valley. I used to think of the woods as a place of peace, a sanctuary where the chaos of life couldn't reach me. The towering trees, the earthy scent of moss and leaves, the gentle hum of wildlife. There was something primal and comforting about it. But after what happened in Cuyahoga Valley, the forest has become a place of nightmares. It started innocently enough. My friends Mike, Jenny, and I planned a weekend camping trip in the park. We'd heard great things about the trails and scenery, and Mike couldn't stop talking about the wildlife we might see. Deer, owls, maybe even a fox if we're lucky, he said as we drove through the winding roads leading to the park. Jenny, ever the skeptic, rolled her eyes. As long as we don't see any bears, I'm fine. I laughed, but part of me was uneasy. I'd read stories about the area, whispers of strange sightings and unexplained phenomena. One in particular stuck out, the legend of the Shadow. Locals talked about a tall, dark figure that moved silently through the woods, always watching but never approaching. It was just a campfire story. I told myself something to give the place a little mystique. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into something we weren't prepared for. We arrived late in the afternoon, the sun casting long shadows across the forest floor. Our campsite was tucked deep in the woods, far from the more populated areas of the park. It was exactly what we wanted. Secluded, quiet, and surrounded by nature, we pitched our tents, built a fire, and spent the evening laughing and telling stories under the stars. It was around 11 p.m. when Jenny first noticed something. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. We fell silent, straining to hear. First, there was nothing but the crackling of the fire and the distant call of an owl. Then I heard it, a faint rustling, like something moving through the underbrush. Probably a raccoon, Mike said, tossing another log onto the fire. Relax. Jenny didn't look convinced, and neither was I. The sound had been deliberate, not the skittering of a small animal but something heavier. Still, we decided to ignore it and went back to our conversation. The woods were full of noises. It was nothing unusual, or so I thought. Later that night, I woke to the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and far too heavy to be an animal. I held my breath, listening as they circled the campsite. For a moment, I thought it might be Mike or Jenny, but then I remembered how distinct the sound of boots on leaves was. These footsteps were different, softer, almost like bare feet padding across the ground. I unzipped my tent just enough to peer out. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange glow over the clearing. First, I saw nothing. Then, at the edge of the trees, something moved, a shadow darker than the night, tall and unnaturally still. It stood there, just beyond the firelight, watching. "Mike!" I hissed, trying to keep my voice low. "Mike, wake up!" His tent rustled, and a moment later, his head poked out. "What? Look!" I whispered, nodding toward the trees. He followed my gaze, his eyes widening as he saw it. The shadow didn't move, but the air around it felt wrong, heavy, oppressive, like the forest itself was holding its breath. "What the hell is that?" Mike whispered, before I could answer. Jenny's scream shattered the silence. We scrambled out of our tents and rushed to Jenny, who was sitting up, pale and shaking. "It was outside my tent," she stammered. "I heard it breathing." I looked back toward the trees, but the shadow was gone. "We're leaving," I said, my voice shaking. "Now." Mike nodded, but Jenny protested. It's the middle of the night. We can't just wander out of here. We can't stay here either. I shot back. Whatever that thing is, it's not normal. Reluctantly, we packed up what little we could carry and started down the trail, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The forest was deathly quiet now, the usual sounds of crickets and rustling leaves eerily absent. Every so often, I glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see the shadow following us. An hour passed, then two. The trail seemed to stretch on endlessly, the trees closing in around us. Jenny was struggling to keep up, her fear turning to frustration. "Are you sure we're going the right way?" she snapped. "I think so," Mike said, though he didn't sound confident. "We should have stayed at the campsite," she muttered. Before I could respond, the footsteps returned. They were behind us, slow and deliberate, matching our pace. I turned, shining my flashlight into the darkness. For a moment, I thought I saw it again, the shadow, standing motionless between the trees. Then it melted into the blackness. "Run," I whispered. We took off, the trail twisting and turning as we stumbled through the dark. The footsteps followed, never hurried but always there, keeping just out of sight. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't dare stop. We finally reached the trailhead as the first light of dawn broke through the trees. I collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air. The footsteps had stopped, but the sense of being watched lingered. "We're safe," Mike said, though he didn't sound convinced. Jenny just sat there, staring blankly at the woods. In the weeks that followed, I tried to make sense of what happened. We told a ranger about the shadow, but he just nodded, his expression unreadable. "People see strange things out here," he said. "You're not the first, and you won't be the last." I started researching the park and found dozens of similar stories. Campers reporting the same shadowy figure, the same feeling of being watched. Some said it was the spirit of a man who died in the woods. Others claimed it was something older, something that had always been there. Whatever it is, I haven't been back to Cuyahoga Valley since. The forest may be beautiful, but it hides something dark, something that watches and waits. If you ever find yourself camping there and feel eyes on you, do yourself a favor, pack up and leave. Because once you see the shadow, it doesn't forget you. Story number 2. The Man with the Axe in Wayne National Forest. I've always loved the woods. There's something about being surrounded by towering trees and the silence of nature that calms me in a way nothing else can. So when my old friend Todd suggested a camping trip to Wayne National Forest, I didn't hesitate to say yes. He called it a chance to unplug, though I suspected it was more about escaping the stress of his divorce. Either way, I figured a few days in the wilderness would do us both some good. Wayne National Forest was known for its dense canopy, winding trails, and peaceful campgrounds, but it was also steeped in history, a place where loggers had worked the land for decades. I'd read about accidents that had happened there, the occasional ghost story, but I didn't pay much attention. Every forest has its legends, right? We arrived late on a Friday afternoon, the sun already dipping below the horizon. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the earthy scent of fallen leaves. Todd had chosen a remote campsite, far from the main trails. No other campers, no noise, just us and the wild, he'd said. We set up camp quickly, pitching our tents and gathering wood for a fire. By the time we sat down to eat, the stars were beginning to peek through the gaps in the trees. The fire crackled warmly, casting flickering shadows on the surrounding trunks. "This is the life," Todd said, raising a can of beer. "No drama, no distractions." I nodded, though I couldn't shake a strange feeling that had been building since we'd arrived. The forest seemed too quiet. No rustling leaves, no distant hoots of owls, just an oppressive stillness. "Did you hear that?" Todd asked suddenly, breaking the silence. "Hear what?" He frowned, leaning forward. "Thought I heard something, like chopping." I listened but heard nothing. "Probably your imagination." "Yeah, maybe," he said, though his eyes lingered on the darkened woods. That night, I woke to a sound. It was faint at first, a rhythmic thud echoing through the trees. First, I thought it was a woodpecker, but as I listened, I realized it was too slow, too deliberate. It was the sound of an axe striking wood. I sat up in my sleeping bag, my heart pounding. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the moonlight filtered weakly through the tense mesh windows. "Todd," I whispered, "you awake?" No response. The chopping continued, steady and unrelenting. Against my better judgment, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The night air was biting, and the forest was cloaked in shadows. "Todd," I called softly, moving toward his tent. Before I could reach it, the chopping stopped. The silence was deafening. I froze, every muscle in my body tense, listening for any hint of movement. Then I saw it. At the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of the dying firelight, stood a figure. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing what looked like old-fashioned work clothes, heavy boots, suspenders, and a flannel shirt. In his hand was a massive axe, the blade glinting faintly in the moonlight. "Hey!" I called, trying to keep my voice steady. "Who's there?" The man didn't move, didn't acknowledge me. He just stood there, staring, or at least, I thought he was. His face was obscured by shadow, and something about him seemed wrong, unnatural. "Todd," I whispered, louder this time. "Get up." The figure tilted his head slightly, as if curious, then turned and walked back into the woods, disappearing between the trees. I stood frozen for what felt like an eternity before finally shaking myself out of it. I rushed to Todd's tent, shaking him awake. "What the hell, man?" he groaned, sitting up groggily. "There's someone out here," I said, my voice shaking. "A man with an axe." He frowned, rubbing his eyes. "Are you serious?" "Yes." He was standing right over there. Todd grabbed a flashlight and stepped out of the tent, scanning the woods. "I don't see anything. I'm telling you, he was there. Probably just a hiker," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. "Let's just go back to sleep." Reluctantly, I agreed, but sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake, listening to every rustle and creak, expecting the sound of chopping to return. But the night remained eerily quiet. The next morning, Todd was in good spirits, brushing off the previous night's events. "You probably imagined it," he said as we ate breakfast. "Middle of the night, half asleep. It's easy to see things that aren't there." But I knew what I'd seen. We spent the day hiking, trying to enjoy the beauty of the forest. The autumn leaves were a brilliant mix of reds and golds, and the crisp air was invigorating. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every so often, I glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see the man with the axe standing in the shadows. That evening, as we sat around the fire, Todd brought up the story of the loggers. "Did you know this place was a big logging site back in the day?" he said, poking at the flames with a stick. "Apparently, there was an accident. One of the loggers got crushed by a falling tree. Some say his spirit haunts the woods." I stared at him. "You didn't think to mention this before?" He shrugged. "Didn't think it was relevant." "Are you kidding me? Relax. It's just a story." But it didn't feel like just a story. That night, the chopping returned. It was louder this time, echoing through the trees like a grim heartbeat. I sat up, my chest tightening with fear. "Todd," I whispered, shaking him awake. "It's back." He groaned but didn't argue. Grabbing his flashlight, we stepped outside together, the beam cutting through the darkness. The chopping continued, coming from deeper in the woods. "Let's check it out," Todd said. "Are you insane?" I hissed. "We should leave. Come on," he said, already moving toward the sound. "It's probably just some idiot messing with us." I followed reluctantly, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. The sound grew louder as we approached, each strike reverberating through the air. We reached a small clearing, and the chopping suddenly stopped. The silence was suffocating. Then we saw him. The man stood in the center of the clearing, his back to us, the axe hanging loosely in his hand. His clothes were ragged, stained with what looked like mud, or was it something darker? His head tilted slightly, as if he knew we were there. "Todd," I whispered, grabbing his arm. "We need to go." Before he could respond, the man turned. His face was pale and gaunt, his eyes hollow pits of darkness. His mouth twisted into a grotesque grin, and he raised the axe. We ran. Branches whipped at my face as we tore through the woods. The sound of footsteps heavy behind us. The chopping resumed, faster and more frantic, as if he were chasing us. I didn't dare look back. When we finally reached the campsite, we grabbed what little we could and bolted for the car. The footsteps stopped as we reached the road, but the feeling of being watched lingered. We never spoke about what happened that night. Todd tried to laugh it off, calling it a bad dream, but I knew better. I'd seen the man, felt his presence, heard the relentless sound of his axe. I've read more about Wayne National Forest since then. The stories are always the same. Campers hearing chopping in the night, seeing a shadowy figure with an axe. Some say he's a restless spirit, doomed to wander the woods. Others think he's something older, something that's always been there. I haven't been back to the forest, and I don't plan to. If you ever find yourself camping there and hear the sound of an axe in the distance, don't investigate, don't stay, because once he sees you, he won't stop, not until you're part of his forest. Story number 3. The Grassman of Salt Fork State Park. I never thought a weekend camping trip could turn into something out of a nightmare. When my friends and I decided to spend a couple of nights at Salt Fork State Park, we were looking for an escape, a chance to unwind, drink a few beers by the fire, and maybe tell some ghost stories under the stars. What we found instead was something none of us will ever forget. It was late October, the air cool but not yet freezing, perfect camping weather. The park was nearly empty, the summer crowds long gone, leaving us with the sprawling forest and its labyrinth of trails mostly to ourselves. That's what we wanted: privacy, solitude. Looking back, it's the kind of isolation that makes you vulnerable, even if you don't realize it at the time. We arrived in the early afternoon, unloading our gear at a remote campsite nestled in a grove of towering oaks. The place was picturesque, the kind of serene spot you'd see in a travel brochure. A narrow trail led down to a small pond, its surface glassy and undisturbed. Beyond that, the forest thickened, an expanse of tangled brush and towering trees that seemed to stretch forever. "This is perfect," Mike said, dropping his pack with a satisfied sigh. "No crowds, no noise, just us and nature. Just make sure the fire doesn't go out," Sarah joked, nudging him. "I don't want to get eaten by coyotes." "Coyotes don't eat people," Dave chimed in, "but Grassman might." I laughed. "Grassman? Really? It's a real thing," Dave insisted. "Ohio's version of Bigfoot. People have been spotting it around here for years." "Sure they have," Sarah said, rolling her eyes. "Mock all you want, but when you hear it in the middle of the night, don't say I didn't warn you." We brushed off his warning as typical campfire bravado. None of us believed in Grassman or Bigfoot or anything like that. We were here for the scenery and a good time, not to chase after urban legends. That first night was uneventful. We built a fire, cooked dinner, and passed around a bottle of whiskey while the flames crackled and sparks danced into the dark sky. The forest was alive with sound, the chirping of crickets, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, the distant hoot of an owl. It was peaceful, comforting, but as the night wore on, the forest seemed to grow quieter. The background hum of wildlife faded, replaced by an oppressive stillness. It was subtle at first, the kind of thing you don't notice until it's gone. We joked about it. "The animals are just scared of us," Mike said, but the unease lingered. Around midnight, I heard it for the first time. A low, guttural growl, faint but unmistakable, carried on the wind from somewhere deep in the woods. It wasn't the sound of any animal I'd ever heard. It was too deep, too resonant, like the rumble of distant thunder. "Did you hear that?" I asked, looking around the circle. "Hear what?" Sarah said, her tone dismissive. "That growl. You're just drunk," she teased, but her voice wavered. We eventually turned in for the night, crawling into our tents as the fire died down to embers. I lay awake for a while, listening to the forest. The growl didn't come again, but the silence was unnerving. I finally drifted off, only to be jolted awake hours later by the sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, crunching through the underbrush just beyond our campsite. I sat up, my heart pounding. The footsteps were slow, measured, as if whoever or whatever was out there didn't care about being heard. I fumbled for my flashlight, unzipping the tent just enough to peek out. The beam of light swept across the trees, illuminating nothing but shadows. The footsteps stopped. "Mike," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Dave, is that you?" No response. The forest was silent again, but the unease didn't leave me. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, listening, but the footsteps didn't return. The next morning, I told the others what I'd heard. "Probably just a deer," Mike said, shrugging it off. "Or a raccoon." "No way," I insisted. "It sounded big, like a person." "You're letting Dave's Grassman story get to you," Sarah said, though she looked uneasy. "This place just messes with your head." We spent the day hiking, exploring the trails that wound through the park. The scenery was breathtaking, rugged cliffs, dense groves of pine, and streams cutting through the forest like veins. But even in the daylight, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there. Mike noticed it too. "Feels like we're not alone out here," he said, his tone half joking but his eyes serious. That night, the forest came alive. It started with the growls low, guttural, and closer than before. Then came the footsteps, heavier this time, circling the campsite. We huddled by the fire, our laughter and bravado from the night before gone. "What the hell is out there?" Sarah whispered, clutching her flashlight. Mike stood, grabbing a stick from the fire. "I'm gonna check it out." "Are you insane?" I hissed. "Stay here," but he was already moving toward the sound, the stick held like a weapon. The rest of us followed reluctantly, the weak beams of our flashlights barely piercing the darkness. The footsteps stopped as we approached the edge of the clearing. The growl returned, deeper and more menacing than before. Then we saw it. A figure stood among the trees, tall and hulking, its outline barely visible in the dim light. It was covered in thick, matted fur, the shoulders broad and hunched. Two glowing eyes stared back at us, burning like embers in the dark. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. The creature didn't move, didn't make a sound, but its presence was suffocating. The air felt heavy, charged with something primal and terrifying. "Back to the camp," Mike said, his voice low and urgent. We moved slowly, never taking our eyes off the creature. It watched us, unmoving, until we reached the fire. Then, with a guttural snarl, turned and disappeared into the woods. We didn't sleep that night. Every sound, every shadow, sent our nerves on edge. By dawn, we'd packed up what little we could carry and left, leaving behind the tents and gear we didn't have the courage to retrieve. As we hiked back to the car, the forest felt alive with unseen eyes. The growls didn't follow us, but the memory of those burning eyes stayed with me. I've read more about Salt Fork State Park since that trip, and the stories are eerily similar to ours. Campers hearing growls, seeing glowing eyes, catching glimpses of something massive and fur-covered moving through the trees. Some say it's a cryptid, Ohio's version of Bigfoot. Others believe it's something else, something older, tied to the land itself. I don't know what we saw that night, but I know I'll never go back. If you ever find yourself in those woods and hear heavy footsteps or see eyes staring at you from the darkness, don't investigate. Don't stay, because Grassman is real, and he's watching. Story number 4. The Ghost of Tar Hollow. I always loved the idea of camping. The thought of leaving behind the chaos of daily life to spend a weekend under the stars, surrounded by the whisper of trees, always seemed so idyllic. When my best friend, Tom, suggested we take a trip to Tar Hollow State Park, I jumped at the chance. It wasn't until much later that I'd regret ever setting foot in those woods. We arrived late on a Friday afternoon. The air was cool and crisp, the kind of fall weather that feels just perfect for a campfire. The drive into the park had been beautiful, winding roads lined with trees whose leaves had turned brilliant shades of red and gold. We picked a secluded campsite far from the main trails, tucked away in a grove of towering pines. "This is going to be great," Tom said as he unloaded the car. "Just us, the fire, and the sound of nothing." He wasn't wrong. The silence was profound. No distant hum of cars, no chatter of people, just the rustling of leaves in the breeze and the occasional caw of a crow. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we got a fire going, cooked some hot dogs, and settled in for the night. The stars above were dazzling, and for a while, I felt the peace I'd been craving. But then came the shot. It was faint at first, a muffled crack that echoed through the woods. I froze, the hot dog halfway to my mouth. "Did you hear that?" I asked. Tom shrugged. "Probably just a hunter. These woods are full of deer this time of year. Isn't it too late for hunting?" I glanced at my watch. It was after 9 p.m. He waved it off. Could be target practice or something. I wasn't convinced, but I let it go. We stayed up for another hour, sharing stories and passing around a flask of whiskey. The night grew colder, and the fire burned down to glowing embers. By the time we crawled into our sleeping bags, the strange sound was all but forgotten. I woke sometime in the middle of the night. First, I didn't know what had roused me, but as I lay there, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching through the underbrush. They were slow, deliberate, and far too heavy to belong to an animal. "Tom," I whispered, shaking him awake. "Tom, wake up. MMM. "What?" he mumbled, sitting up groggily. "Listen." He fell silent, and we both strained to hear. The footsteps were still there, circling the campsite. Then they stopped. "Probably just a deer," Tom said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Deer don't walk like that," I whispered. He grabbed the flashlight and unzipped the tent. The beam of light swept across the trees, illuminating nothing but shadows. "See? Nothing there," he said, zipping the tent back up. "Go back to sleep." I tried, but the feeling of being watched kept me awake. The footsteps didn't return, but the woods felt alive in a way I couldn't explain. The next morning, over breakfast, I told Tom about the stories I'd read online about Tar Hollow. Ghost hunters, paranormal investigators, locals, they all had their tales. The most famous was about the hunter. Apparently, a guy died out here in a hunting accident years ago, I said. Some say he was shot by his partner. Others say he shot himself by mistake. Either way, people claim his ghost still wanders the woods. "Yeah, and Bigfoot lives in my backyard," Tom said with a laugh. "I'm serious," I said. "People hear gunshots in the middle of the night, but there's never anyone around. Some even say they've seen him, a man in an old cowboy hat, carrying a shotgun." "Spooky," Tom said, rolling his eyes. "Sounds like someone watched too many ghost hunting shows." I dropped the subject, but the uneasy feeling lingered. That night, the woods felt different. The air was heavier, the silence oppressive. Even the fire didn't seem to crackle as brightly as before. Tom tried to lighten the mood with jokes, but his laughter felt forced. Around 11 p.m., we heard the first shot. It was louder this time, echoing through the trees like a thunderclap. We both froze, staring at each other. That was close, Tom said, his voice barely above a whisper. Maybe too close, I said, my stomach nodding. Then came the footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, crunching through the underbrush just beyond the firelight. Tom grabbed the flashlight again, shining it toward the sound. "Hello?" he called. "Anyone out there?" No response. The footsteps stopped. Then we saw him. He stood at the edge of the clearing, half hidden by the trees. He was tall, his frame broad and imposing, dressed in tattered clothes that looked like they belonged to another era. On his head was a cowboy hat, tilted slightly forward, casting his face in shadow. In his hands, he held a shotgun. "Who are you?" Tom called, his voice shaking. The figure didn't answer. He just stood there, staring, or at least, I thought he was. It was impossible to see his eyes beneath the brim of the hat. Then he turned and walked back into the woods, his movements slow and deliberate. Tom and I didn't sleep that night. We sat by the fire, clutching flashlights and knives, jumping at every sound. The footsteps didn't return, but every so often, I thought I heard the faint click of a gun being cocked. By morning, we decided to cut the trip short. We packed up quickly, neither of us saying much. The woods were eerily quiet as we hiked back to the car. When we reached the parking lot, an older man in a ranger's uniform was there, leaning against his truck. "You boys look like you've seen a ghost," he said, chuckling. "Maybe we did," Tom muttered. The ranger's smile faded. "You hear the gunshots?" I nodded. "And we saw someone, a man with a shotgun and a cowboy hat." The ranger's face darkened. "Yeah, people see him from time to time. We call him the Hunter. Local legend says he died out here years ago. Some kind of hunting accident. Folks say he's still looking for his prey. That's just a story, right?" I asked, my voice shaking. The ranger shrugged. "Maybe, but I wouldn't come back to find out. It's been months since that trip, and I still can't shake the memory of that figure standing at the edge of the clearing. The way he seemed to watch us without moving. I've read more about Tar Hollow since then, and the stories are always the same. The gunshots, the footsteps, the man in the cowboy hat. I don't know if he's a ghost or something else, but I do know this. If you ever find yourself in Tar Hollow and hear a gunshot in the middle of the night, don't wait to see who fired it, because some hunters never stop hunting." Story number 5. The Curse of Dead Man's Hollow. I've never been one to believe in ghost stories, superstitions, campfire tales, urban legends. None of that ever seemed real to me. But after what happened at Dead Man's Hollow, I'm not so sure anymore. Some places hold onto their darkness, and some stories, I've learned, are rooted in truth. It all started with a stupid bet. My friends and I had been sitting around one night, scrolling through a list of haunted places in Ohio, laughing at the absurdity of some of the legends, when we came across Dead Man's Hollow. Jake, the self-proclaimed skeptic of the group, suggested we go check it out. "It's just an old swamp," he said, grinning. "A weekend camping trip, and we can say we survived the infamous Dead Man's Hollow. Maybe we'll even catch a ghost on camera." I wasn't thrilled about the idea, but everyone else jumped on board. I didn't want to be the odd one out, so I reluctantly agreed. I told myself it would be nothing more than a spooky adventure, a chance to hang out with friends and prove that the stories were just that, stories. We arrived late Friday afternoon. The area around the hollow was desolate, the kind of place that feels cut off from the rest of the world. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth, and the towering trees cast long, spindly shadows over the narrow trail that led into the swamp. As we hiked deeper into the hollow, the atmosphere grew even heavier, the silence oppressive. Felt like the woods were holding their breath. "This is perfect," Jake said, dropping his pack in a small clearing near the water's edge. "Creepy as hell, but perfect." We set up camp quickly, eager to beat the setting sun. The swamp was eerily beautiful, the water still and black, reflecting the darkening sky. But as night fell, that beauty turned sinister. The trees loomed like skeletal fingers, and the faint sound of water dripping somewhere in the distance began to sound like whispers. We sat around the fire, sharing ghost stories and trying to outdo each other with tales of haunted places and unexplained phenomena. Jake was in his element, mocking every story and daring us to scare him. "You guys seriously believe in this crap?" he said, laughing. "Ghosts, curses, it's all just people scaring themselves." "Then you won't mind staying up tonight to keep watch," Sarah said, smirking. "You know, in case Dead Man's Hollow lives up to its name." Jake grinned. "Bring it on." That night, I woke to a sound. At first, I thought it was the wind, but as I lay there, I realized it was something else. A low, mournful moaning, carried on the breeze. It was faint, almost like a sigh, but it sent chills crawling up my spine. I sat up, straining to hear. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting faint shadows on the surrounding trees. The moaning grew louder, joined by the faint sound of footsteps, light, deliberate, like someone trying not to be heard. "Jake," I whispered, nudging his tent. "Wake up," he groaned, fumbling with the zipper. "What? Do you hear that?" He fell silent, listening. The footsteps circled the campsite, slow and deliberate. Then they stopped. "It's probably just an animal," he said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Animals don't moan like that," I hissed. Before he could respond, there was a sound like a rope creaking under tension, followed by a soft thud. My blood ran cold. "What the hell was that?" Sarah's voice came from her tent, trembling. "I don't know," I said, "but I'm not going out there to find out." The next morning, we tried to laugh it off. "Just the wind," Jake said, though he didn't sound convinced. "This place plays tricks on your ears." But the mood had shifted. The air felt heavier, and every sound seemed amplified: the rustle of leaves, the croak of frogs, the occasional splash of water that made us all jump. That afternoon, we explored deeper into the swamp, following an overgrown path that wound through the trees. The farther we went, the more unsettling it became. The trees seemed to close in around us, their gnarled branches forming twisted archways. The air grew colder, and the silence was broken only by the occasional drip of water. Then we saw it. A tree stood in the center of a small clearing, its trunk gnarled and twisted. A rope hung from one of its branches, swaying gently in the breeze. The end was frayed, as though something heavy had been cut loose. "That's unsettling," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's just a rope," Jake said, though he wouldn't look directly at it. We stood there for a long moment, none of us speaking. The air felt wrong, like the clearing was charged with something we couldn't see. Finally, Jake turned and started back down the path. "Come on," he said. "This place is messing with our heads." That night, the footsteps returned. They were louder this time, more deliberate, circling the campsite like a predator stalking its prey. We huddled by the fire, clutching flashlights and knives, too scared to move. "Who's out there?" Jake shouted, his voice trembling. "Show yourself." The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then we saw him. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, silhouetted against the trees. He was tall and thin, dressed in ragged clothes that hung off his skeletal frame. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed his face, but his eyes, oh God, his eyes burned with a faint, unnatural light. He didn't move, didn't make a sound. He just stood there, staring. "Jake," I whispered, "we need to leave." Before he could respond, the figure raised a hand, pointing toward the tree with the hanging rope. Then he was gone. We didn't wait until morning. We packed up what little we could carry and ran, the footsteps following us every step of the way. The swamp seemed alive, the trees closing in around us, the air thick with the sound of whispers and creaking ropes. By the time we reached the car, the sun was beginning to rise. The footsteps had stopped, but the sense of being watched lingered. I haven't been back to Dead Man's Hollow since, and I never will. Jake tried to rationalize what we saw, calling it a shared hallucination. But I know better. That place is cursed, haunted by something that should have been left in the past. If you ever find yourself in those woods and hear the sound of footsteps, don't follow them. Don't look for the man with the hat, because once he finds you, he might not let you leave. Story number 6. The Crying Woman of Hocking Hills. I never considered myself superstitious. Ghost stories, urban legends, even the so-called haunted places around Ohio, none of it ever fazed me. But the night I spent in Hocking Hills changed everything. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend getaway with my fiancée, Emily. She'd been pushing for some time away from the city, and the idea of hiking through the lush forests and exploring the caves and waterfalls of Hocking Hills sounded like the perfect escape. We'd planned it for weeks. 2 nights at a secluded campsite. No phones, no distractions, just us and nature. The drive down was peaceful, the flat farmlands of Ohio giving way to rolling hills and dense woods. By the time we reached the park, the late afternoon sun was casting golden light through the trees, dappling the ground with patches of warmth. Our campsite was perfect, nestled deep in the forest, far from the more crowded areas of the park. The sound of a nearby stream trickled through the air, mingling with the rustling leaves and distant chirping of birds. Emily was thrilled, her excitement infectious. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of calm. We spent the day hiking to Old Man's Cave and Cedar Falls, marveling at the towering cliffs and cascading water. Emily kept stopping to take pictures, her laughter echoing through the woods as she tried to capture the perfect shot. "Isn't this amazing?" she said as we rested on a moss-covered rock, the sound of the falls roaring behind us. I nodded, smiling. "Yeah, it really is." We returned to camp as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. I started a fire while Emily prepared dinner. As the night fell, the forest grew quieter, the hum of insects and distant hoots of owls the only sounds breaking the silence. "Did you know this place is supposed to be haunted?" Emily said as she stirred the pot of stew over the fire. I raised an eyebrow. "Oh yeah," she grinned. "Yep, there's a legend about a woman who drowned in one of the streams here. They say she was looking for her child, who'd wandered off and disappeared. She spent days searching, calling out his name, until she slipped on the rocks and hit her head. Some people say her spirit still roams these woods, crying for her lost child." "Great," I said, trying to sound unimpressed. "So we're camping in ghost territory." Emily laughed, tossing a marshmallow at me. "Relax, it's just a story." That night, I woke to the sound of crying. First, I thought it was part of a dream, but as I lay there, the sound grew clearer, a soft, mournful sobbing carried on the breeze. I sat up, straining to hear. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting faint shadows on the tent walls. "Emily," I whispered, shaking her gently. "Do you hear that?" She stirred, mumbling something unintelligible before turning over. I sighed, listening again. The crying seemed to come from the direction of the stream, faint but persistent. Against my better judgment, I unzipped the tent and stepped into the cool night air. The forest was bathed in moonlight, the trees casting long, spindly shadows. The sobbing continued, louder now, pulling me toward the water. "Hello," I called softly, my voice barely above a whisper. No response. I grabbed the flashlight and followed the sound to the edge of the stream. The water glistened under the moonlight, tumbling over rocks in a quiet rush. The crying was louder here, echoing off the trees, but I saw no one. "Is someone there?" I called, shining the flashlight around. The beam illuminated the rocks and trees but revealed nothing out of the ordinary. Then I saw her. She stood on the opposite bank, her figure barely visible in the dim light. She wore a long, flowing dress, her hair cascading over her shoulders. Her back was to me, but her shoulders shook with the force of her sobs. "Ma'am," I called, my voice trembling. "Are you okay?" She didn't move, didn't acknowledge me. I hesitated, then stepped closer to the water. "Do you need help?" I asked, my flashlight shaking in my hand. Slowly, she turned. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow and rimmed with shadows that seemed to stretch into infinity. Her mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came out, only a low, guttural wail that sent chills racing down my spine. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight, and then she was gone. I woke up to Emily shaking me. "Jake, wake up!" I opened my eyes, blinking against the sunlight streaming into the tent. My heart was pounding, my skin clammy with sweat. "Are you okay?" she asked, concern etched on her face. "You were yelling in your sleep." I sat up, running a hand through my hair. I think I saw something last night." "What do you mean?" I hesitated, unsure how to explain. There was a woman by the stream. She was crying, and when I tried to talk to her, she disappeared. Emily's expression shifted from concern to unease. "Are you serious?" I nodded. She glanced toward the stream, her eyes narrowing. "Maybe we should pack up and leave." We spent the day trying to shake off the incident, hiking to Ash Cave and taking in the breathtaking views. Emily seemed distracted, though her usual enthusiasm dulled. I didn't mention the woman again, but the memory lingered at the edge of my thoughts. That night, the forest felt different. The air was heavy, the silence oppressive. Even the fire seemed dimmer, its flames struggling to fend off the darkness. As we crawled into the tent, Emily reached for my hand. "Do you think we're safe out here?" "Of course," I said, though I didn't believe it. The crying woke us both this time. It was louder, closer, resonating through the trees like a lament carried on the wind. Emily clutched my arm, her eyes wide with fear. "That's it," she whispered. "We're leaving." We scrambled out of the tent, grabbing only our essentials. The crying followed us, growing louder as we hurried toward the trailhead. "Jake," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "Look." I turned to see the woman standing by the stream again, her dress billowing in the night breeze. She raised a hand, beckoning. "Don't," I said, pulling Emily away. "Don't look at her." We broke into a run, the forest closing in around us. The crying didn't fade but seemed to echo from all directions, surrounding us. When we finally reached the car, I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking. We threw our gear into the trunk and sped down the dirt road, the crying fading into the distance, back in the safety of our apartment. We tried to rationalize what we'd experienced. Maybe it was a trick of the light, a combination of exhaustion and overactive imaginations. But deep down, we knew better. I started researching the history of Hocking Hills and found stories dating back centuries. Accounts of a crying woman seen by streams and waterfalls, always searching, always mourning. Some said she was the spirit of a mother who lost her child. Others believed she was something older, something tied to the land itself. Emily refuses to talk about that night, and we haven't been camping since. But sometimes, in the stillness of the night, I think I hear it, the faint sound of crying, just beyond the edge of hearing. If you ever visit Hocking Hills and hear a woman crying in the distance, do yourself a favor, don't follow the sound. Don't look for her, because once you see her, she might not let you leave. Story number 7. The Crying Woman of Alum Creek. When my friends suggested a camping trip to Alum Creek, I jumped at the chance. It had been years since I'd spent a night under the stars, and the idea of a quiet weekend by the water, far from work emails and city noise, was exactly what I needed. Alum Creek was known for its scenic beauty, lush forests, clear skies, and the expansive lake that reflected the moon like a mirror. But I didn't know about the stories. Not then. It was a Friday afternoon when we arrived, me, my girlfriend Emma, and our friends Jake and Lauren. The park was beautiful, just as I'd imagined. The water stretched out endlessly, a shimmering expanse of blue bordered by dense trees. We picked a campsite close to the lake, secluded enough to feel like we had the place to ourselves, but not so remote that it was eerie. We set up our tents, started a fire, and spent the evening talking and laughing as the sun dipped below the horizon. The first stars appeared, twinkling faintly in the clear night sky. Jake had brought a guitar and strummed a few songs while we roasted marshmallows. It was perfect until it wasn't. It must have been close to midnight when I first heard it. A soft, distant sound carried on the breeze, barely audible over the crackle of the fire. First, I thought it was an animal, maybe a bird or the wind rustling through the trees. But as I listened, the sound grew clearer. It was crying. "Do you hear that?" I asked, interrupting Jake's song. Emma tilted her head, frowning. "Hear what?" "Someone's crying." Lauren laughed nervously. "You're just trying to freak us out." "No, I'm serious," I said, straining to hear. "It's coming from the lake." Jake set down his guitar and listened. "Now that you mention it, yeah, I hear it." We all fell silent, the laughter and chatter fading. The crying was faint but unmistakable. A low, mournful sobbing that seemed to echo across the water sent a chill down my spine. "Probably just some kid who wandered off," Emma said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Out here? At this hour?" Jake shook his head. "Doesn't seem likely. Should we check it out?" Lauren asked, glancing nervously toward the lake. "Better to stay here," I said quickly. "We don't know what's out there." We tried to go back to our conversation, but the sound lingered, growing louder as the night wore on. Eventually, we retreated to our tents, though sleep didn't come easily. I woke in the early hours of the morning to the sound of footsteps crunching on the gravel path near the water. For a moment, I thought it was one of my friends, but when I peeked out of the tent, I saw a figure standing by the lake. It was a woman, her silhouette barely illuminated by the faint light of the moon. She wore a long, flowing dress, and her hair fell loose around her shoulders. She stood perfectly still, staring out over the water. "Emma," I whispered, shaking her awake. "There's someone out there," she groaned, rolling over. "What are you talking about?" "There's a woman by the lake." Emma sat up, rubbing her eyes. "Are you sure? Maybe it's just Lauren." I shook my head. "She's wearing white, and I don't think it's Lauren." By the time Emma looked, the figure was gone. The shoreline was empty, the water undisturbed. "You're imagining things," she said, lying back down. "Go to sleep." But I couldn't. The image of the woman lingered in my mind. Her stillness, the way she seemed to dissolve into the darkness. The next morning, over breakfast, I told the others what I'd seen. Jake and Lauren exchanged uneasy glances. "You've heard the story, right?" Jake asked. "What story?" "The crying woman," Lauren said, her voice hushed. "She drowned in the lake years ago. Some say she was looking for her child. Others say it was an accident. But they all agree she never left." "Seriously," Emma said, raising an eyebrow. "You're trying to scare us." "I'm not joking," Jake said. "People have seen her, heard her crying, just like last night." I tried to laugh it off, but a sense of unease had settled over me. That night, the crying returned. It was louder this time, closer, the kind of sound that crawls under your skin and sets your nerves on edge. We sat by the fire, each of us on edge, our laughter replaced by wary glances toward the lake. "We should go see what it is," Jake said, standing. "Are you crazy?" Lauren hissed, grabbing his arm. "What if it's, I don't know, dangerous?" "It's probably just some kid messing with us," he said, grabbing a flashlight. "Come on, let's put this to rest." Against my better judgment, I followed him, Emma and Lauren reluctantly trailing behind. The air grew colder as we approached the water, the sound of crying growing louder with each step. At the edge of the lake, we stopped. The water was still, the surface reflecting the moon and stars like a mirror. For a moment, there was nothing. Then we saw her. She was standing in the shallows, her white dress billowing gently in the breeze. Her back was to us, her head bowed, and her shoulders shaking with sobs. "Ma'am," Jake called, his voice trembling. The woman didn't respond. "Are you okay?" Emma asked, taking a hesitant step forward. The woman froze, her sobbing cutting off abruptly. Slowly, she turned to face us. Her face was pale, almost luminous, her features twisted in grief. Her eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a wave of cold wash over me, paralyzing me where I stood. "Help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible but somehow cutting through the stillness like a knife. Before any of us could move, she began to dissolve, her form fading into mist and drifting over the surface of the lake. We ran. Back at the campsite, we packed up as quickly as we could, abandoning the fire and anything we couldn't carry. None of us spoke as we hiked back to the parking lot, the crying still echoing faintly in the distance. It's been months since that night, but I can't shake the memory of her face. Her eyes filled with sorrow and something darker, something hungry. I've read more about the lake since then, about the accidents, the disappearances, the people who swear they've seen her. I don't know if she's a ghost, a figment of our imagination, or something else entirely. But I do know this: if you ever visit Alum Creek and hear the sound of crying, don't follow it, because some stories are true, and some spirits don't want to be left alone. Thank you for joining us on this chilling journey through Ohio's haunted forests and campsites. From the ghostly drums of Zaleski Forest to the eerie curse of Dead Man's Hollow. These stories remind us that even in the stillness of nature, the unknown is never far away. If you enjoyed these tales, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss our next dive into the mysteries of the unexplained. Until next time, stay safe, and remember, some shadows in the woods are meant to remain undisturbed.